Hi, my name is Suzanne Aasman. I'm a media historian and I work at the University of Groningen in the Netherlands. And I like to use the occasion today to talk about the value of family websites, assessing the value of archiving family websites. And as a case study, I used the collection of Access for All, a collection that was already introduced yesterday by Kees Tezelski. So before I start talking about this Access for All collection, I'd like to explain a bit further why I got interested in this type of material. And especially important for me is to make a kind of historical connection to earlier practices of people who wanted to record their memories. I connect this to an ongoing practice over more than a century where people in everyday life kind of explore new media technologies as a way of recording their memories, sharing their memories. And this type of practice, of course, we all know maybe as home movies or amateur filmmaking, or maybe as video making when you think about the 80s, for instance. And you can see them as a kind of ongoing, continuous type of practice where people appropriate media technologies. And as part of a research project, which I was part of a few years ago, I was kind of considering how we could see these new emerging practices like making a website or producing a YouTube video and uploading them on a platform, or sharing pictures maybe on Facebook, how you could connect those new practices with the more traditional home movie making. So as part of this research project, which was called Changing Platforms of Ritualized Memory Practices, the Cultural Dynamics of Amateur Media, it was a whole group of researchers kind of explored how changing technologies of memory production, so it could be film, video, or digital, shape new practices and rituals of memory staging. So when you think about film, of course, we think about screening. When you think about video, it's more about broadcasting them on some television set, or in the digital age, sharing them in some format online, in a kind of domestic or maybe in a more public venue or site. The idea was to specifically take a longue durée perspective, so for more than a century, and look at diachronic and synchronic perspective. So we were looking at moments of transitions, for instance, from photography to film, or from film to video, or from video to the digital, looking at similar developments at the same time when we tried to do a more synchronic approach. And we were especially interested in what are the discontinuities and what are the continuities. On different ways, could be about how people thought about the idea of the amateur, so thinking about amateur media discourses. And an interesting way of thinking about this could, for instance, is user-generated content, the term we have come to use for media productions that are made by amateurs or do-it-yourselfers who upload it. Is that a tradition that is part of the amateur media? We were also thinking about user generation. So if you look at 100 years of home movie making, can we see changes in people who kind of take up the camera, who started making a YouTube video, in terms of age, for instance? So we can see in the early 20th century it was usually male, many times father, so at a age between 20 or 30 and 50. But in the 80s, for instance, when video came along, we could see that there were more young people connecting to the camera and starting to experiment with it, more women who were attracted to the camera. So different types of users, and sometimes different per period, different user generations, types of users. And also interesting is the idea of this amateur media dispositive. Which I will explain in the next slide. But so, for instance, looking at these continuities and discontinuities, the idea is easily made that when you look at 100 years of making and sharing memories, nothing changes that much. It's about the first steps, or a birthday party, or as Richard Chalfin, who is an anthropologist, once said, the choice of what to present symbolically varies little from generation to generation. And it kind of mirrors maybe a more recent quote from Henry Jenkins, who said something like, our lives, relationships, fantasies, desires also flow across media channels. Being a lover or a mommy or a teacher occurs on multiple platforms. So the idea of continuity is, of course, very strong in these examples. Which is, I think, only part of how we can look at those histories. It is therefore what we aim for in the project, to have a more systematic approach and to really look at different types of technologies that were introduced over the years, emerging new technologies in terms of cameras or color or sound, or when you think about the digital, maybe also about the emergence of new platforms or websites where you could share your memories. So the material dimensions, the dimension where you talk about recording and producing and sharing, but also in relation to the textual dimension. So how does the way that people present, record their memories, or how they produce their memories, change in relation to the technology, or vice versa. And also then in relation to the perceptual dimension. So the way that the viewer or the visitor listens or reads or interprets and gives meaning to the memories that are produced. And the idea was then to take from this perspective, historicize this amateur media dispositive, and analyze then these relationships taken from the perspective that it is a dynamic relation which can change over time, and which is very much connected also to changing social and cultural dimensions, and maybe also political and economic dimensions. And I think although this concept of dispositive was especially designed for within film theory and film studies, the overall idea of this integrated system where you not only talk about the material, but also about the perceptual and also about maybe the types of stories that we want to tell, can be an interesting method to also look at, for instance, websites, family websites. That was my idea, which I really did not research into depth until I had a nice talk with Kees Tezelski of the National Library of the Netherlands, who told me about this project he was working on, which was a selection and harvesting of homepages of one of the oldest Dutch providers, Access for All, which started in 1993. And if you want to know more about this project, you could probably listen to the video that was recorded yesterday. And Kees told me about this project and about the 18,000 URLs that were identified. And when I told him about my project, he said, oh, well, but then it might be interesting for you to have a look at this collection, because so far I come across a lot of family websites, people who make family albums, friends who share intimate material. I never thought about selecting them, but maybe they're interesting for you. So that was the start of a very interesting new project I'm now start working on. So what now is ahead of me and some of my research assistants is that we start looking at these URLs and looking and selecting family websites, websites that specifically are aimed for members of a family, or maybe sometimes also a close circle of friends, where they somehow want to share pictures or want to share some memories. There are many, many examples, and so far we have been going through many of these URLs and try to come up with a selection. This is, for instance, an interesting example of a husband and wife who come from two different countries. One is from the Netherlands and the other one is from Denmark, and they use this website to tell about their lives. They have a menu where they talk, where you can see that they have a special button for the grandkids, for the kids, but also for their garden, for their vacation, for their hobbies. So all of the topics, which I know are so familiar in many home movie collections, are now played out in different forms. And it's an interesting way of thinking about how new technologies have changed the types of stories that people tell to each other. This is another interesting example where you can also see that many new users are sometimes also very much users who are very technically oriented and also interested in other types of web-related technologies. Sometimes they make it an effort to really think about a nice graphical interface, and sometimes it's very casual in the way that pictures are presented. In this case, a website of a certain man who becomes 50 and likes to share his pictures of the party as part of his of this particular day. It's very interesting to see, and I was mentioning this idea of user generation before, that I think new types of users took this moment of innovation and this new emerging technology to kind of see how they can share their lives. In this case, a young girl who kind of builds this website about her own life, and in one of the opening pages she talks about "this is me, haha," and then in the next page she explains that the site hasn't finished yet and that she's working on it, but that people have to wait for more. It's interesting, I think, also to think about how these new users kind of need to appropriate these new ways of working, and how they are still kind of connected to more traditional formats, but also finding new aesthetics, but also new ways to address people. Because who is she talking to when she say "this is me, haha"? Is she talking to her family, to her friends, or to a more general audience? And how does that relate to the type of information that she's willing to share? This is, of course, many times before Facebook, so it's an interesting moment, a moment of transition where you can see how the internet, how the idea of users being able to produce material but also share it with other people has changed considerably. If you think about home movies as something that was screened usually at a Sunday afternoon in a very close domestic circle in the private space of the house, and now suddenly this has become a much more public space. And of course there are many issues here as well, but about the ethics, of course, about me looking at them and archiving these types of material. But I think therefore it's all the more interesting to start thinking about these selections. And just a very nice last example about selecting this type of material and assessing. When I discussed the issue with my research assistant who go through the URLs, the idea was what to select, what is worthwhile saving. Is that a page like this where you can only see a yellow page and no more, or the black one, or this green one, or This is a blue one. Someone saying, welcome to my website. I'm still learning how to develop a website, but here already a nice picture, and it's blue and empty, no more. This one is even only white, saying, hi visitor, vacation La Gamoira, but there's nothing else. Or this one who has a bit more, but still is kind of empty. I think just like my presentation is still under construction, so I'm still thinking about what and how we can assess the value of these family websites. I think they can be very important, show us on the one hand also how can we connect everyday media technologies today to earlier practices, and how can we understand this transitional moment which Access for All, I think, kind of represents, where you can see this transition from being a much more closed hobby to something that became much more public, especially when you think about later developments of Facebook and Instagram and all these kind of social media platforms, and that we here have this moment where we can kind of in-depth look at how people try to appropriate these new means of sharing memories, of producing and sharing memories. And for that matter, I think these family websites are certainly valuable and should be preserved for future research. Thank you very much.